Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, for those of you that may not have heard my show before, what is God Save the King? Let me describe it briefly here. God Save the King is my ongoing 35-year plus investigation into what the nativity really would have looked like. And this is because the traditional version of the nativity story is frankly full of holes. It didn't look like that. Now, in the broad strokes, it did, because everybody's going to get worried really quick when I say it didn't look like that. So the first thing they're going to do is go, oh my God, what do you mean? What do you mean? Well, in the broad strokes, certain things remain the same. Did Mary and Joseph travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem? Yes, they did. Was Jesus laid in a manger? Yes, he was. But you know what? That doesn't look like we think it does. Okay. Was he born in a stable? No, but he was laid in a manger. Those two are not the same thing. So broad strokes, was he laid in a manger? Yep. Was he discovered by shepherds? Yep. Did angels appear to the shepherds? Yep, absolutely. Did wise men from the east find the young child and pay homage to him as well? Yes, they did, but it wasn't the same night as the shepherds. It was 15 months later, and there weren't three of them, and they weren't kings. So these are the kind of things that we discuss in God Save the King, is what would have the nativity story really would have looked like. And I delve into the astronomy. You know, what was it that the Magi saw? What was it that the Magi saw? What did they see? Because they show up at the court of Herod the Great and they say, we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. What does that mean? Ladies and gentlemen, what does that mean? Well, we talk about it here on God Save the King. We may or may not talk about it today, but I've talked about it in other episodes, and I will talk about it in future episodes as well. We also take a look at the political background of the nativity. Who was Herod the Great, and what is his story, and why does he play a role in this at all? And he frankly plays an enormous role. As a matter of fact, that is where the title God Save the King comes from, is because Herod the Great would have been the Roman appointed client king of Judea. The Roman appointed client king. So read in between the lines, and I just said illegitimate. He is not a legitimate Judean king. He is an illegitimate Judean king. He's the Roman appointed king of the Jews. Now, if you are Jewish and you are following the law of Moses, if you are a devout Jew, then that means you are looking for all the way, you got to dial it all the way back to the book of Genesis. You're looking for the promises that were made to Abraham, because God promised Abraham a people, right? He promised Abraham descendants. Now, we learn later on that was both physical and spiritual descendants. And we also learn later on that among the physical descendants is going to be the seed, the promised seed, the Messiah, the Mashiach Nagid. But God promised Abraham descendants. He promised them a land, a geophysical area that they would live in, that would be not just their land, but frankly, God's land, right? So God promised Abraham descendants. He promised those descendants a land to live in, to call their own, and then he promised to bless them in the land. And the blessing in the land is not just limited to abundance of crops. It's called in Scripture the land flowing with milk and honey. And make no mistake, that is true. The promises include, crops and herds and milk and honey and abundance and things like that. But what it was most truly promising was God's presence, that God would live among his people. See? So if you are a true Israelite or a true Jew, this is what you are looking for. You're looking for God to fulfill his promises to the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham in the land, and then blessed by God's presence, right? Now, under King David, the nation of Israel, or the kingdom of Israel, came as close as they ever did to achieving that. Because if you go back to the promises in the book of Genesis, in particular in Genesis chapter 15, we are told that the land grant is much more than what the modern state of Israel encompasses. It goes all the way from the river of Egypt all the way to the great river, the river Euphrates. Now that's very interesting, because now the river of Egypt, while that could be the Nile River, it's entirely possible that it means the Nile. It's also possible that it means a different river that's more in the Sinai area, between what would now be southern Israel and Sinai, that it was more that general area where there's a particular river that is what God was referring to. But the Euphrates, that's pretty obvious which river he means there. He means the Euphrates. Now the question becomes, if that land is supposed to extend from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, do they mean to go due east? Because if you have to go due east to hit the Euphrates, you're going to go several hundred miles before you're going to hit the Euphrates. But if you go north to hit the Euphrates, you've got where the Euphrates is in like modern day Syria and Turkey. So when under David's kingdom and then under Solomon's kingdom as well, they did control those regions up there, the Golan Heights and what we would call Lebanon, and then parts of Syria and possibly even parts of what would be modern Turkey, because the Euphrates is up in that region as well. So it depends. We can't really tell precisely what he means. So did he mean to go due east to hit the Euphrates, to go northeast to hit the Euphrates, or to go north to hit the Euphrates? Which did he mean? But the point being is that under David and Solomon, they controlled something resembling that geographic area, because they controlled areas north of what would be modern Israel that extended to the Euphrates River. Okay. And therefore, scholars to this day debate whether David and Solomon were actually occupying the land grant that was promised to Abraham or not. We're not really quite sure. But the point being is, once again, if you are a devout Jew, you're in your mind, you are going back to the promises made to Abraham. You're thinking about the kingdom under David that came as close as it ever did to fulfill the promises being fulfilled. But then we know what happens. Solomon's son Rehoboam messed things up. The kingdom divides into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And then a couple hundred years later, the northern kingdom goes into captivity. 100 years after that, the southern kingdom goes into captivity. And then we begin this period of time where Israel is under the dominion of foreign powers for the next, it's in context about 600 years. Now, in extended context, it goes even further, but we're focusing on about a 600-year period of time from when the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians and they became the superpower in the region. And then the Persians conquer the Babylonians, then the Greeks conquer the Persians, then the Romans conquer the Greeks. So each of those four empires has dominion over the kingdom of Israel, or the kingdom of Judah, or Judea as it was called in various permutations. Okay. But now when you get to the time of Christ's birth, if you are a devout Jew, this is what's going on in your head. You're still thinking about Abraham. You're still thinking about David, and you're asking the question internally and maybe even externally, when, O Lord, are you going to fulfill your covenant promises to your covenant people? This is what they would have been looking for. So now this is a very broad overview of what God Save the King is all about. But now, because this is the context, This is the context we need to be looking at. And now we put the story in this context. Now you put the story in the context, and we start to fill in certain details that just we don't find in the traditional nativity story, that, and also that we discover through diligent research. We discover, frankly, they're inaccurate. And what I have been doing for several weeks now is I have been focusing on Jewish wedding practices, because Joseph, Mary, and Jesus were Jewish. You hear me harping on this all the time. It frankly can't be said often enough. Joseph was Jewish. Mary was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. Some Christian denominations, not all, but some Christian denominations engage in this weird reverse engineering and treat Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as if they were Christians, which is really weird because they weren't. They were Jewish. And everything they would have said and done would have attested to that fact. And Joseph and Mary would have had a Jewish wedding. They wouldn't have had this bizarre wedding concept that is shared in the book called the Protoevangelium of James. And if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me harp on the Protoevangelium of James. The Protoevangelium of James is an apocryphal work written somewhere between 150 and 250 AD, with most scholars landing in about 200, right? But when we critique this work, we can tell by the language used that it was written in about 200 AD. And when we could critique it and we cross-reference it with the Bible and we cross-reference it with history and things like that, what we discover is that this little book, because it's not very long. I mean, I've got it up here on my computer in a Word document, and it's only about 5,400 words long. It's not very long, right? 5,400 words, and they've got it divided into into about 24 sections. But this thing has so many details that are not correct. It's not even funny. It really is. If it would be funny if this weren't such a serious subject, because the story that this little book tells is just so wrong. I'm sorry, it's just so wrong. And the nativity doesn't look like this. So what I did last week in talking about these wedding practices, I didn't really focus in on the wedding practices themselves last week very much. I wound up focusing in on giving an overview of everything that would have been going on the day he was born, the astronomy, plus the fact that it would have been Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, and things like that, and how all these the shepherds would have been watching their flocks in open field because it was fall and not winter, and the fact that this makes a much better picture. We don't have to look for exceptions. We can look for the rules actually fitting properly, that the pieces of the puzzle fit together properly, and you don't have to say, oh yeah, well, yeah, this was an exception, right? Because if you look for a winter birth date, if you look for a December 25th birth date, somehow you've got to rationalize the shepherds being an open field, which they would not have been. Okay. Now, does that mean it's impossible? No. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. But does that mean it's rational or reasonable? Wow. That is that's an entirely different scenario altogether. Is it rational or reasonable? That's a different question. So what I want to do today is I do want to continue talking about some of these Jewish wedding practices and the fact that Joseph and Mary would have engaged in this. So what you can do is, if you know the template of a Jewish wedding, you can take this template and overlay it over Joseph and Mary's story. And frankly, we now have a really good idea what this really would have looked like, because a Jewish wedding was divided into two primary components. And those two components were, number one, the betrothal, and then number two, the nuptials. Now, the betrothal is much more serious than what we would call an engagement. The betrothal meant that the bride and the groom were now, in fact, married. They were committed one to another. They were, in fact, married, but they had not come together sexually yet. They had not consummated the marriage yet. So what would happen is they would literally write a written contract. It'd be a written contract called the ketubah in Hebrew, and this contract would be written up by the fathers of the bride and the groom, right? Primarily the father of the groom, okay? But the father of the bride had to accept and had to agree. Both the groom and the bride themselves had to agree. But what would happen is that it was arranged marriages, right? And there is no reason biblically, there is no reason historically to challenge the notion that Joseph's dad and Mary's dad were the two that arranged this marriage. You don't find this in the Protoevangelium of James because both Joseph and Mary are kind of presented as de facto orphans in a way. Now, we are in the Protoevangelium of James, we are told about Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna, right? But then we're also told that they leave her at the temple. They take her to the temple and they leave her there when she's 3 years old. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute because that's junk. That didn't happen, right? But that's what we're told in the Protoevangelium of James. So in a way, she's kind of this de facto orphan in a way, right? And then when we are introduced to Joseph in the Protoevangelium of James, he's just a man of Judea, okay? That's all we're told. He's, according to the Protoevangelium of James, he's older, he's a widower, and that he already has kids. Now there's no reason for that to be true. Why would that be true? Okay, now I know a lot of people accept it. There's a lot of people who accept these records and go, yeah, well that's got to be true. Then it's a historical book from 200 years later, but that must be her parents' names, and Joseph must have been older. And it's like, well, why? Why? Because it certainly doesn't line up with the Bible. It certainly does not line up with the Bible. And if they were Jewish, everything about this record in the Protoevangelium of James raises questions. Everything raises questions, okay? So, but to begin with, like I said, Joseph's dad and Mary's dad would have spoken to each other and said, hey, probably a good idea to get these two hitched. Now, let me rephrase that though, however. Let's put it in context. Let me tell you the story and let's put it in context. They're in the tiny village of Nazareth in northern Israel in Galilee. They're not in the south, they're in the north, because that's what we are told. When we are introduced to them in the Bible, we are told that Joseph was a man of Nazareth, and when we're introduced to Mary, we're told that Mary was a young woman of Nazareth. Okay? Now, is it possible that they could have moved there from the south? Of course it's possible. Is it reasonable? No, it's not. It's not reasonable. There's no reason to believe that they themselves moved there from the south. Now, is it reasonable to consider that their ancestors migrated from the south? See, because we are told that both of them are from the tribe of Judah and the house of David. Both of them are from the tribe of Judah and the house of David. And the tribal allotment granted to the tribe of Judah is in the south. So why do we find Judeans in the north? That's a legitimate question. But the better answer for how they got there is not that both Joseph and Mary migrated individually, but that their ancestors many years before migrated there, because historically that fits very, very, very well, because under the Hasmonean kings of Israel, they promoted the migration of Judeans to the north for a variety of reasons that we're going to talk about in a minute. A variety of reasons. See, so there's our explanation behind why do we find Judeans in the north. The reason we find Judeans in the north is because under the Hasmonean kings, they promoted the re-Judaizing of the north, because the north had been largely, number one, depopulated by the captivities, predominantly the Assyrian captivity, and then the Assyrians had also moved other captives from other nations into that part of Israel, because that was their foreign policy, was to dilute the native ethnicity to make the people less likely to rebel. Okay, so when the Assyrians took the northern kingdom captive, they would have removed an enormous portion of the Judean population and then moved a foreign population into northern Israel. So the combination of those two things would have been less Jews, more Gentiles. So now, when many hundred years later, when the Hasmoneans are controlling the Hasmonean kingdom of Judea and they're repopulating the north, they are encouraging devout Jews from the south to move to the north to re-Judaize the region. So that makes complete sense. Most likely it would have been both Joseph and Mary's grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. It could have easily been 100 years prior to either of them being born that their ancestors moved to Galilee. Now, do we know exactly? No, but that fits the history extremely well, whereas the Protoevangelium of James doesn't fit the history very well at all. Because here is another factor. An additional factor to why the Hasmoneans were encouraging Judeans to travel to the north is because, ready, the power circles in Jerusalem, the elites, the temple priesthood, and the Hasmoneans themselves, unfortunately, and things like that were becoming more and more Hellenized. In other words, they were adopting Gentile practices common to the Greeks. They were becoming more and more Hellenized. They were becoming more and more worldly. And frankly, they were becoming more and more corrupt. So devout Jews were finding it hard to live within the southern kingdom of Judea and to live near the temple, because here they are watching these, for lack of a better word, these very liberal government officials, politicians, the royal family, and the priesthood, the Sadducees, because the Sadducees dominated the priesthood. Now, the Pharisees were extremely popular with the people. They were popular with the common man, and the Pharisees were more conservative and therefore more devout. But the Pharisees were a minority in the temple priesthood and in the Sanhedrin. That's a dirty little secret. The Pharisees were represented in the Sanhedrin, but conservative Pharisees were the minority in the Sanhedrin, and the temple priesthood was also dominated by the Sadducees, all of which were very politically and religiously liberal. Okay, very, very left, for lack of a better word of saying it. So therefore, if you were more devout and you were more conservative, you might not want to hang around Jerusalem. You might want to go to Galilee and move there, live there, and then develop little villages, because Galilee, ironically, at this time was one of the more densely populated areas within the Roman Empire. And this is exactly why, because you would have families and clans, extended families, relocate from Judea to Galilee. And that's what Nazareth is. Nazareth was a new village founded by Judeans from the south who moved to the north and decided to plant a new village and found a new village. And this is why it's highly probable that it was either Mary's parents, or Mary and Joseph's parents, or grandparents or great-grandparents that moved to Galilee. Maybe they lived in another village or another city in Galilee initially, but then around about 30 BC is when they would have founded the village of Nazareth. Okay. Now, it might have been Joseph and Mary's parents. That's entirely possible because the village of Nazareth was a new village at the time that Joseph and Mary lived there, and therefore at the time that Jesus was born. Now, so this all goes to the fact that it would have been a little village of only about 400 people. There probably would have been about 50 buildings. That's about it. Okay. And the geographically, the town was nestled in these hills, in the rolling hills, in the mountainous area of Galilee, right? There were mountainous regions in Galilee. So they weren't like right in the mountains, but they were in the rolling hills near the mountains. And then Nazareth would have been settled in these little rolling hills. And then at the bottom of the hill, there was a natural spring that provided water. And that's where the village of Nazareth would have been centered around. But you really got to put this in context. Only about 400 people, only about 50 buildings. That means everybody knows everybody. And what I need to do here, I haven't had the opportunity to do this yet. I really need to do it. So my listeners, if you know of resources that can help me do this, please send me an email. contact.godsavethking@gmail.com. contact.godsavethking@gmail.com. Send me an email. Help me with the resources in this, because there's got to be demographic studies that will tell us, if not the percentage of male, female, adult children in Galilee itself, what is the most likely breakdown of adults, old adults, young adults, married, single, children, et cetera, okay? Because here's the point. If there's only 400 people, and I think about back when I was in high school, my high school, there was 500 students in my graduating class. 500 students in my graduating class. I knew every one of them. I knew every one of them by name. So if I live in a village of 400 people, I know everybody. Everybody knows everybody. And the breakdown, right? I mean, if you can, let's just do a mind experiment here. Let's just do a thought experiment. In a village of 400 people, if you have those between 0 and 10, 10 and 20, 20 and 30, 30 and 40, 40 and 50, 50 and 60, and then we'll call it 60 and 70, and then 70 and over. That's 8 categories, right? That's 8 categories: 70 and over, 60 to 70, 50 to 60, 40 to 50, 30 to 40, 20 to 30, 10 to 20, and then 0 to 10, right? 8 categories divided by 400 people, that's 50 in each category, right? Now, it's probably weighted more towards the adults, I think, right? I'm not sure. I'm not a demographics expert. But if you just look at it that way, 400 people divided into 8 categories means roughly 50 people in 8 categories, right? So there's 50 children under 10. There's 50 teenagers, right? So, and this is, like I said, this is just a thought experiment. If Joseph and Mary are in their late teens, which is most likely how old they were, because they did marry young, they married as teenagers, although they did not necessarily marry as young as the traditional story tries to force on the narrative. Okay, and it does. The traditional nativity tries to force Mary to be quite young, only about 16. More realistically, she was 17, 18, maybe even 19. Joseph was probably 18 or 19, right? But they did tend to get married no later than about 20, right? But here's the thing. If they grew up in Nazareth, like I said, there's roughly 50 persons in each of those categories. So the likelihood that Joseph and Mary were both born in Nazareth and knew each other from a young age is extremely high. Extremely high. So much so that by the time Joseph in particular is starting to get into his late teens, if he's noticing Mary, quote unquote, in that way, quote unquote, right? And then he goes to his dad and he says, "Hey, Dad, I really got my eye on Mary. Would you please approach Mary's father and ask him if we can arrange a marriage?" See, then that's how it would have gone down. Joseph would have gone to his father and said, "Hey, I got my eye on Mary." And then Joe's dad would have talked to Mary's dad and said, "Hey, what do you think? Should we get these two hitched?" And then if they both agreed, then yes, then they would have written up the ketubah, would have written up the marriage contract. They each would have talked to their children, Joe's dad with Joe, Mary's dad with Mary, and said, "We've arranged a match. What do you think?" And then if they agree, right? If the kids agree, then it would have been done very quickly. So what would have happened is like I said, is Joe would have approached his father and had his father ask Mary's father. And chances are, see, here's the other thing. If they already knew each other, they were probably already friendly, and that this probably wouldn't have been a foreign idea at all. This probably would have been a very natural extension of their pre-existing relationship. They already probably knew each other. They were probably already friendly. They were probably already attracted to each other. And and maybe see now, and here you go. Let's do it again. Let's play the thought experiment again. 400 people, 8 categories, 50 persons per category, but each of those categories is 10 years. So now divide each category by 10. That means that's in the category of the teenagers, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, blah, 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 right? That means you've got roughly 10 kids that are 11, 10 that are 12, 10 that are 13, 10 that are 14, 10 that, this is very rough because we know it would never work this way mathematically, but this is a guesstimate. This is an educated guess, right? But that means that in like the 16 to 20 range, right? If that entire group of 10 years is divided up for 50 people, then that means 5 of them are 16, 5 are 17, 5 are 18, 5 are 19. You're only looking at 20, 25 kids, right? And then if you divide that in half, male and female, that means Joe probably had maybe 8 to 10 girls to choose from, maybe somewhere in that neighborhood, right? Plus there is the possible, what's the word I want to use? Competition from the other young men in the area, right? But like I said, if they knew each other and were already friendly, already maybe attracted to each other, this could have been a very natural extension of the relationship that already existed. So therefore, when Joe tells his dad, "Hey, Dad, I really want to get married. Please talk to Mary's dad," the two of them have a conversation, and then they say, "Yeah, let's do it," right? And then, like I said, the parents talk to the kids agree, and then what they would have done is they would have gotten together, most likely at Mary's parents' home. They would have gotten together at their home. They would have possibly had a meal together. They would have then read the contract out loud, and then there would have been several cups of wine that would have been drank, that would have sealed the deal, and especially Joseph pouring a cup of wine to give to Mary, and then when Mary drinks it, that is her accepting the terms of the ketubah, and that they are now officially betrothed, right? So this is how they would have gotten married, not this bizarre thing that we read in the Protoevangelium of James, where what we are told in the Protoevangelium of James is that Mary's parents dropped her off at the temple in Jerusalem, and that she lived within the temple precincts from the age of 3 to the age of 14. Now, what's really interesting and frankly bizarre about this is that when you read the Protoevangelium, when it gets to the place where she is 12 years old, this is considered the traditional age when a young woman would begin her menstrual cycle. Therefore, if she's living within the temple precincts, that means if she starts her menstrual cycle, that means she is unclean and she can't be within the temple precincts. So this is why our attention is drawn to this in the Protoevangelium of James, is that she now gets old enough where she is entering puberty, and this becomes a consideration because now she can't live in the temple, at least not in the same way she did up until now, right? See, so that's a problem. So that's why we are introduced to this idea that, oh, as soon as she became 12 years old or 13 years old, now we've got to figure out a solution. So the solution in the Protoevangelium of James is to get her married, okay, which is really weird, right? And then what they do is they start this very odd lottery, which is exactly what it was. We are told that the high priest calls together the widows of Judea, the widowers of Judea, to find a man to quote unquote marry her, right? Now, what we are also introduced to here is that we are introduced to the idea that Mary and other, here you go, ready, consecrated virgins lived within the temple. Now, here's the problem with that. That didn't exist in Judea. There is no indication, none. Sorry, folks. There is no indication that the concept of a consecrated virgin existed in the Jewish religion. That's foreign, it's pagan, it's Roman, it comes from other areas, and it's been introduced from the outside into this story. Primarily, it comes from the priestesses of the Temple of Vestes in Rome, which were known as the Vestal Virgins. That's where this comes from. I can almost guarantee it, because Vestal Virgins, here you go, were chosen when they were children. They were chosen when they were children, and then they swore a vow of 30 years of celibacy, that they would be consecrated virgins devoted to the Roman goddess Vestes. See, and hence the phrase Vestal Virgins. They were consecrated to the goddess Vestes, and they served in the temple of Vestes, and they had a very exalted position in the Roman Empire, very exalted, okay, which, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend my Christian brothers and sisters who believe this stuff, but this is where this comes from. This is why in certain denominations, Mary has this very exalted position, is because the Vestal Virgins had a very exalted position in the Roman Empire. But the problem is that Mary was not Roman. Mary was Jewish, and the Jews did not know this concept. They just didn't. Now, defenders of the consecrated virgin concept will try to take you to several verses in the Old Testament that say, see, women served in the temple. And those verses are there. I don't have them in my notes in front of me, so I can't quote them, but they are there. There's a small handful, maybe from 3 to 6 verses in the Old Testament that talk about women who served in the temple. But here's the very, very obvious problem. It's women. It just says women. It doesn't say virgins. It is not explicit. It says, no, could they have been a virgin? Of course, it's possible. But here now we come back to that thing again, right? You can't manufacture a doctrine from an exception, which is what happens every time we look at a detail of the nativity story is someone wants to manufacture a doctrine based on the exception, not the rule. Okay, so did women serve in the temple? Yeah, they did. Right now, they did not serve liturgically. So that, in other words, they didn't have the same jobs as the priests or the Levites. They were not priestesses. They were women who did, frankly, domestic work for the priests and the Levites. Okay, that's really what they did. And of course, one of the examples we get is the prophetess Anna, which after Jesus is born and after Mary goes through her ritual Jewish 40 days of purification, that's when Joseph and Mary go to the temple, and they encounter this prophetess named Anna. Right now, we know that, because so this is one of the examples. Although, pardon me, this one's clearly from the Gospels in the New Testament, but we are told that Anna had lived and served in the temple for a long time as a widow. But a widow is very different from a consecrated virgin. Entirely different. Anna was not a consecrated virgin; she had been married, right? And although therefore she practiced a kind of celibacy because she was widowed, and in Jewish culture, a widow would have remained celibate, right? In order to remain devout, you would have remained celibate for the rest of your life. So she would have practiced a form of celibacy, but it is not this liturgical, consecrated celibacy that we are told was supposed to have existed in Judea at that time. We have no Jewish records. We have no Jewish practices like that. We have women serving in the temple. Yes. Do we have consecrated virgins serving in the temple? No, we have no indication of that. And where we do have consecrated virgins, especially consecrated virgins chosen at a young age and then de facto swearing a vow of celibacy for kind of the rest of their life, in a manner of speaking, as we find that from the Roman priestesses, the Vestal virgins, the priestesses that served in the temple of Vestes, right? Because that's where we get the similar story here, is we are told that Mary is a quote unquote virgin of Israel. Okay, well, where's that? It's not in the Bible. You don't find it in the Bible anywhere, and I'm not aware of finding anything like that in the Talmud or the Mishnah. Okay, and even if you do find it, once again, okay, it's going to be the exception, not the rule. You're not going to find a classification, okay, like that in Jewish thinking. So, like I've said, you can take the template of a Jewish wedding and superimpose it over Joseph and Mary, and now you can know what their life would have looked like. Okay, and it wouldn't have looked anything like the Protoevangelium of James. You would have had an arranged marriage by Joe's dad and Mary's dad. There would have been two young people in their late teens, probably 17, 18, 19 years old. They probably already knew each other. They were probably already very well acquainted and probably already friends and probably already quite attracted to each other, so that now this was a very, very obvious thing to do. And it probably would have been very readily agreed with. So then they would have met at the house of Mary's parents, most likely, right? This is the likely scenario that you would have encountered. They would have met at the house of Mary's parents. They would have read the ketubah, right? Then there would have been, see, this is important, and I go into detail about this in the previous segments, is you go into the mohar, the bride price, right, which is what Joseph would have paid, quote unquote, to purchase his bride, which is why this is called Bought with a Price. That's why this series is called Bought with a Price, is it's a takeoff on this mohar, right? The mohar that Joseph would have paid to acquire Mary as his bride. Also the matan. The matan would have been the love gifts that Joseph would have given to Mary at the betrothal, right? And then you have the shaluhim. Now this is the dowry. Oftentimes the mohar and the shaluhim, the bride price and the dowry, are confused. The dowry would have been Mary's share of her father's estate. See, because young men, they inherited their portion of the father's estate when their father died. See, and then the sons would take over the father's business, and then they would care for their mother, for their widowed mother, right? And then the eldest son got the double portion. He was due to the right of primogeniture, he'd get the double portion because he would be responsible for taking care of his mother. Well, young women got their inheritance at the time that they married, and that's what the dowry was, right? So there would have been the dowry that would have been given from Mary's father to Mary, quote unquote, right? Now, I have talked about how in other sessions, I really believe that Mary had no brothers, that Mary only had sisters, and that therefore the principles surrounding the daughters of Zelophehad in the Old Testament came into play here because Mary married within her tribe, and therefore that would mean that Mary's father de facto adopted Joseph as his son. So therefore the dowry, I do believe, would have been a double portion of the inheritance, right? And it would have been given to Joseph and Mary at their betrothal, right? But then, and the betrothal is called the Kedushin. And then after the betrothal, right, this is very important, Joseph takes off to go build the huppah. And there's none of this in the Protoevangelium. The Protoevangelium of James, Mary just goes and lives with Joseph. And here's the other weird thing. See, because this is not Jewish. This is not Jewish. This is not Jewish. This is not Jewish. And in case I haven't made myself clear, this is not Jewish. Mary and Joseph get, quote unquote, married in the Protoevangelium of James, and she goes and lives with him, but she swears a vow of celibacy, and so does he, that they're married, but that they're never going to have sex. Well, that's a problem because in Jewish culture, no tokens of virginity, no marriage. Okay? You are not legally married. So once again, this is an exception to the rule, and it's an exception within an exception within an exception within an exception, and it stretches the limits of credulity very quickly and very far, right? Because Joseph would have gone off to build the huppah. He would have been out of the picture for about 1 year, and then they would have come back together, right? And this is when you would have had the groom, quote unquote, steal the bride, right? And this is very important because see this, we find this language all through Scripture. When Joseph would have began building the wedding chamber, the huppah, it's his father that would have told him when it was ready, right? And we see that the most stunning example of this, of course, is in John chapter 14, where Jesus tells his disciples, behold, in my Father's house are many mansions. Behold, I go to prepare a place. Well, that is conspicuous, and it's deliberately conspicuous. See? And then he says, and I go to prepare a place that where I am, you may be also, and I will return for you to draw you unto myself. He is absolutely and unequivocally painting a picture of a Jewish wedding, right? Now, why would he be painting a picture like this if his own mother hadn't experienced anything like it? That doesn't make any sense. And it wouldn't have made any sense to the disciples as well. He's painting a very clear picture of a Jewish marriage. So what would have happened is that Joseph would have gone off and built the huppah, like I said. And then about 1 year later, one day, his father just would have said, hey, Joe, good to go, dude. You're ready. You're ready. The huppah is ready. And go get your bride. Right? So now Mary, now there's more to it, right? The pieces of the puzzle that we do have to insert into the story now is the fact that Mary does become pregnant by the Holy Spirit. She leaves Nazareth temporarily to seclude herself. It says that she can't be discovered to be pregnant, right? So she leaves Nazareth and goes to Judea and stays with her cousin Elizabeth for 3 months. And then here's the thing. She comes back. The reason she comes back is she comes back for the nuptials, because by that time, it's about 1 year since they have been betrothed. It's been about 1 year since they've been betrothed, and she has to have a husband for her child, because if she is not legally married, then he is not a legal member of the congregation of Israel, and he will be disqualified from being the Messiah. All right? And you heard me correctly. If Mary and Joseph are not married, and they're not married according to Jewish tradition, not some farcical, apocryphal ceremony that we read about in the Protoevangelium of James, if they are not married according to Hebrew tradition, then Joseph cannot legally adopt Jesus, and therefore Jesus is illegitimate. He's a bastard, right? He's illegitimate, and therefore, according to the bastard curse of Deuteronomy, he cannot inherit, which means which means it doesn't matter whether Joseph is of the tribe and lineage of David anymore, because Jesus, quote unquote, isn't, quote unquote, right? And frankly, I need to talk about that. I'm going to run out of time today, so we'll talk about this next time, right? Is we need to take a look at the bastard curse. So I will, and I've taught on this before. It's very provocative, and we actually see it in action in the Old Testament in a very, very meaningful way. It actually is, it's invoked. The bastard curse is invoked in the Old Testament. So very much like the daughters of Zelophehad, these things are not there just coincidentally, right? They are there for a reason. They are there prophetically. They are there because they provide for a foreshadowing of how God is going to make this happen. And see, and I'll talk about this very briefly here, because now, see, you've got the daughters of Zelophehad, which I believe happened with regard to Mary and her sisters, and that Mary's dad didn't have any male heirs, right? So therefore, he invokes the daughters of Zelophehad and adopts Joseph as his son so that Mary can inherit. So there's one very interesting, what's the word I want to use? Concept from the Old Covenant that gets invoked here. Then you've also got the fact that if you follow Mary's genealogy, she is descended from Jeconiah, but now Jeconiah was actually put under a blood curse, which is really weird, because that blood curse says, yeah, you know what? None of your progeny is ever going to inherit the throne. But the distinction there is the virgin conception, because it's not Mary's blood, right? It's the Father's blood, and the Father is actually God. See, so there's a very interesting end run on the curse of Jeconiah, and now you've got this thing with the bastard curse as well, which is that Jesus can't fall under this curse. Jesus cannot fall under this curse. And that is why Joseph and Mary have to be legally married. They have to be legally married according to Jewish custom in order for Jesus to be legitimate, which qualifies him to be the Messiah. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's going to be our show for the week. I'm going to wrap up here. I do want to remind you to go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Click on that big listen button and join me on my show, God Save the King, every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where the truth will be told. You can, of course, listen on your Google, your Apple, and your other home devices. You can say, hey, Siri, play Truth Be Told Radio Network. And also, we are available on pretty much every major podcast platform. So if you want to look up, Truth Be Told Radio Network and God Save the King, on your major podcast platforms. You will probably find us there. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. My name is Tim Keyes. I'm the host of God Save the King. Signing off. God Save the King.